Hey guys, it's Miss Sinclair for AP World History Modern. We are continuing our Unit 0 lectures, and today we are going to be learning about early China and Israel. So remember, everything in Unit 0 will not be on the AP test. However, I think it is important for you to have some context for what we will be learning about, and that content will be on the test. There's a lot of references back to things that happened before 1200. So remember, as you watch this, you are expected to be taking notes on your own for your own use, for studying and activities. You are also going to be completing a daily cover page that you are going to be turning in. And then as you watch this on Edpuzzle, if you are one of my students, you are going to be completing the questions along the way. Benefits of doing this as a video instead of in person means you can pause the video at any point. You can rewind if you need. If you have questions or you need me to clarify something, please just let me know and I'm happy to do so. Okay, so let's get started. So for your bell work for today, I would like you to compare the technology and knowledge of Mesopotamia, Egypt, and the Indus River Valley. So this is hearkening back to what you learned about yesterday or whenever you watched the video, and use this as a self-assessment tool. Can you answer the bell work question without actually looking at your notes, or do you need to look? If you need to look, then that means the information didn't stick in your head. This is why we do these questions, so you know, okay, I need to study a little bit more. Maybe I need to read that part of the textbook. Maybe I need to review my notes. But be sure to complete your bell work on your daily cover page. All right, notes, early China and Israel. Ignore the homework. That was from last year. You will be able to explain how and why religions and belief systems affected the development of Israel, Mesopotamia, and Zhou, China. Okay, so these are some of our early civilizations in the Western and Eastern hemispheres. So this is the broader category we're going to be talking about for the next several lectures, but we're starting specifically with China. I recommend that you learn the Chinese Dynasty song. It's a little bit silly. It is it's super silly. But the Chinese dynasties serve as a really helpful chronological tool as you mentally organize the rest of your historical knowledge. Right? It's hard to remember what came first. Was it Charlemagne or the Byzantines? Was it Queen Elizabeth or King George? Right? It's easy to get those things confused in your head. But if you can remember, okay, yeah, the Ming are at the same time as Christopher Columbus, then you can place things in sequential order. The Han are at the same time as the Romans. So all you have to remember in that case is the order of the Chinese dynasties. So it's to the tune Frère Jacques, Frère Jacques, Frère Jacques. I always end up. I know it in Spanish and English, and I mix them all together. So if you're going to sing this, and I recommend you do, it doesn't take that long to memorize. It goes, Cheng Zhou Qin Han, Cheng Zhou Qin Han, Sui Tang Song, Yuan Ming Qing Republic, Yuan Ming Qing Republic, Mao and Dong, Mao and Dong. You're welcome for that, all of you. Thank you. I will be accepting my Grammys later. It's a useful organizational tool. All right, but China. So we talked a lot about sort of the Middle East, talked about Mesopotamia, about Egypt, about the Indus River Valley. Okay, but what's happening in China? Stuff's always happening in China. Well, China, obviously, is not the entity that we know it today. But I'm going to use that term to refer to this general geographic area, and because throughout history they have had relative political unity. You'll see there's a lot of consistent things. from Chinese dynasty to Chinese dynasty. So we see, once again, our earliest settlers are picking up and building their communities along a river valley. In this case, it's the Yellow River. We've discovered pottery, wheels, farms, silk, but archaeologists haven't found any evidence of writing or knowledge of how to use metals in these earliest civilizations. So China is going to be very isolated geographically, just like they were, the Egyptians were. In this case, they are going to be isolated by the Himalayas to the south. So let me, sorry guys. So you have the Himalayas right here, right? So that acts as a pretty effective boundary. Then you are going to have more mountains. Then you have some deserts, desert, mountains. So in general, oceans, right? Tibetan plateau. So the Indus River Valley is like over here, but there's no way that anyone settling along the Yellow River can just be like, oh, let me just walk on over, right? The Mount Everest is right here. So that's going to leave China very isolated in comparison to like the Indus River and Mesopotamian civilizations. Because of that, their development is going to be very distinctive. So this should harken back to what you learned about last year with human geography, right? Isolation creates diversity. So our very first dynasty, the Xia dynasty, may or may not have been legit. It might have been imaginary. Historians aren't sure. It might have been mythical. But in general, we know that for sure our first dynasty is going to be the Shang dynasty. And they're going to cover a relatively small area, especially when you compare it to modern day China or, in fact, Han China, which we'll talk about later this unit. We do see that they are going to develop agriculture independently. They're going to develop a lot of technological innovations that other places were able to get the information from each other. They will use bronze. So we see that people lived in small mud huts for the most part. They made pottery on the wheel. They made silk. They used bronze. We know they had a writing system. We know that they practiced ancestor worship. This is going to be a constant throughout Chinese history, is this ancestor worship and also reverence, right? So you see that in the late 19th, early 20th centuries. Empress Cixi wants to build railroads across China because she's like, oh my gosh, we're so behind in the times compared to everyone else. But there's some concern that the railroads would go over places where ancestors have been buried and disrupt their spirits. We see that the ruler, the king, is going to be seen as a link between heaven and earth. And we know that invasions from different nomadic groups in Central Asia will cause a temporary decline. So the Shang aren't around they're around for 600 years. That's pretty impressive. But the main guy we're going to be talking about here is going to be the Zhou. Oh, this is a pretty neat video. Yeah. Watch it if you want. It's going to be the Zhou. So the Zhou are going to settle in the Wei River Valley, and their founders are Wen and Wu Wang. So Wu is going to claim that the last Shang emperor was depraved. He was tyrannical. He neglected to honor the gods and ancestors. He killed and abused his subjects. So he claimed that heaven, literally the god Tian, right, for the Zhou, their god, it translates to heaven. So the god, heaven, had granted Wu authority, had removed authority to rule from the last Shang ruler and given it to Wu, the first Zhou ruler. So, since he has now been granted the authority and legitimacy to rule, he can do so as long as he looks over his subjects. And proof that the gods chose him is the prosperity and stability of his kingdom. All right, so this concept is known as the mandate of heaven, and this is a really important continuity for Chinese history. So historical thinking skills that we will be developing throughout the year in AP World History include change and continuity. You really want to pay attention to what things are staying the same across the centuries. What are the consistent things? And what are the big dramatic changes? So the mandate of heaven is going to be one of those continuities for Chinese dynasty. You see this cycle, this dynastic cycle that emerges. So heaven, the god, heaven, has the power to establish the ruler of China and to take power away from that ruler if they have failed to conduct themselves justly and in the best interests of their subjects. So every time we see a turnover in dynasties, you see this justification. So the old dynasty, in this case, right, the Shang, old dynasty, are going to, that was a terrible circle. They overtax the citizens. They don't protect them, so you're invaded a lot. This is one of those things you look for. Injustice. So heaven is like, boo, you suck. I'm removing power from you, and I'm giving it to someone new. We often see in conjunction with this natural disasters, revolts, invaders, famine. So a new leader emerges, one who heaven likes. And this new ruler will restore peace. He will protect his citizen. He builds up infrastructure, walls, canals, roads. The economy flourishes. But then over time, as this empire gets older, as the leadership gets corrupt, as the emperor turns his attention away from ruling to his own pleasures, his concubines, his drugs, his own comfort, you see unrest. And to pay for all these comforts, you overtax the citizens. You don't spend the money on infrastructure because you're spending it on yourself. You end up with corrupt rulers, so injustices emerge. You add that with natural disasters, and you see how the cycle would continue. So it begins with the Zhou, but it's going to be a continuity throughout Chinese history. So what does the Zhou government system look like? Well, it's feudal. It's going to give, think of like feudal Europe, right? So you have the emperor, and the emperor gives land to someone who's loyal to him. And that person controls the land and all the farmers on that land. But ultimately, that governor has to answer to the emperor. So he gave territory to family and allies to control under him because he can't rule all this on his own. We see that over time, the kingdom will erode. So first you have the Western Zhou period, because ultimately the feudal system doesn't work, because these isolated rulers, these governors, are like, what the heck? I'm doing all the hard work governing here, and I'm paying taxes to this emperor. why don't I just not pay taxes and continue to just govern this territory? So that will lead to the Eastern Zhou period, where they're going to move the capital. So in the Eastern Zhou period, we see that the center of power has shifted. We see political fragmentation and a lot of small states inside the territory really fighting with each other. At this point, the monarchs are basically just figureheads. So because of all the war, Sun Tzu is going to write his very famous book, The Art of War. This is something that you will hear quoted throughout your life. Some of you may have read it. If not, you might yet read it. And essentially in it, Sun Tzu argues that a successful general uses deception, intuits the energy potential of a landscape, so how can I use the physical environment, and psychologically manipulates both friend and foe to win. The best victories are without fighting, because then you can use all the resources that the other side. We see that the lack of leadership up top leads to a growth in professional bureaucrats, so professional government workers, scribes, clerks, just basic government workers. So, out of this, we are going to really see the emergence of 3 unique belief systems. The first one is an important continuity. It's Confucianism. So Confucianism is a concept you really should understand because it is such an important part of Chinese societal culture. It really influences how people interact with each other and continues to influence relationships in China today. So Confucius is a scholar. He's unable to find employment as an official or an advisor, and so he attracts students who listen to what he's teaching. He looks back at the early Zhou period, the Western Zhou period, kind of as this golden age. He reframed traditional institutions and values. So he teaches that the way you act at home prepares you to be a citizen. Every person has a place and has duties based on their age and gender. Filial piety, so respect to your parents, respect to those above you, include obedience, reverence, and love. But this is the same relationship that should exist between a citizen and a ruler. So you can take this relationship between like father and son and also apply it to ruler and citizen. So just like a father should sacrifice for himself, go hungry so his son can eat, and the son should be obedient to their father, even if they don't fully understand why. When you're 5, you don't really understand why can't I just run into the street? Or like, why can't I swim in the pool by myself? But you trust that your parents have a good reason for telling you that you can't do these things. So in the same way, parents provide for their children and children obey their parents. A ruler should provide for their citizens by protecting them, by equipping the economy, by building up infrastructure. And a citizen should obey the ruler. That means paying taxes. That means following laws. It means not rebelling. This relationship could be applied anywhere, right? Servant to master, wife to husband, right? Women should trust and be obedient for their husbands. Their husbands should sacrifice and provide for and respect their wives. So it goes back to this idea of Run, R-E-N. It's humaneness, this universal sense of benevolence and compassion that should pervade every action. So he's really going to value practicality, right? If everyone kind of knows their proper place and how they should relate to each other, and they're focused on sort of serving like the greater good, doing their job, then society's going to run so smoothly. So Confucius Confucius really values then education, right? Because how can you fully understand what your job is unless you are educated? Self-regulation, right? It's like just because you want to eat a gallon of ice cream right now or you want to get drunk tonight, is that really going to be what's best for your family? Like you getting drunk tonight means you can't do your job in the morning. That means you can't feed your kids. Proper exercise of power, propriety and etiquette, familial love and respect for parents, righteousness, honesty, loyalty, respect. So what he does here is he provides a philosophical and ethical framework for how to conduct your life and understand your place in the world. This is not a religion. Let me be very clear. Confucianism is a philosophy. It's a way to live your life. Confucius believes that you should respect your gods and ancestors and religious traditions. So, at the time, his teaching was not as well known as it will become later. Okay, next philosophy, Taoism. If Confucianism is all about like tradition, following the rules, like it's very, type A, just like do what you're supposed to do. Taoism is the opposite. It's like the hippie philosophy of ancient China. Just like go with the flow, man. That's basically Taoism. So Taoism is going to be founded by Lao Tzu. It's a Chinese school of thought that's going to originate in the Warring States period, which will follow the Zhou Dynasty. And it provides an alternative to the Confucian emphasis on hierarchy and duty, right? Confucius is all about know your place and do your job. Taoism is like, nah, man. Withdraw from empty formalities, withdraw from distractions and hierarchies. This is all dumb. It's meaningless ultimately. Taoism envisions harmony when people allow nature to guide their actions, right? So according to Lao Tzu, the material world blocks us, keeps us from perceiving a higher reality, right? If we are too worried about what we're going to wear or what people are going to think about us, then we are missing out on the deeper, more significant truths that are out there, right? That means education, rational analysis. These are obstacles. They distract you. Really, we should just cultivate our senses and trust our instincts. The primal world was happy before civilization, right? Knowledge, society corrupts us. Instead, if we just were all like back to hunter-gatherers, like we'd be happy. So he teaches the world is always changing. Thus, there is no absolutes. There's no absolute morality or meaning. There's no absolute truths. There's no absolute right or wrong. All that matters is your understanding of the Tao, the way. So to Taoism, like there's no evil actions, right? There's just like, are you going with the Tao? Are you going with the way? Are you going against it? Don't engage with the world at all. Don't fear death. Avoid conflict at all costs. Just don't act. Kind of every man for yourself. Just do whatever feels good to you. Who cares if that means you turn away from evil stuff? You see someone getting beat up, but Taoism doesn't say you should intervene, right? Just do what feels good to you. Avoid conflict. Just go with the flow. It promotes humility, frugal living, simplicity, right? Taoism says you don't need a lot of stuff. You should just you could just live in the forest with nothing, and you should be happy because you're going with nature. It's out of Taoism we get the idea of yin and yang. So it has little influence ultimately politically, right? Confucianism is much more useful from a political standpoint. But it does have a large influence on Chinese medicine, art, and poetry. Finally, last one, legalism. Legalism comes out of the Qin state, which is going to follow the Zhou state during the Warring States period. you're going to have this one guy. Legalism's only really around for like 30 years. Right? Lord Shang is going to be in charge of the Qin government. And he looks around at the world and goes like, Confucians are naive to think the past is perfect and that you need to care about people. You don't need to care about people, right? Rulers should trust their judgment. There is none of this, rulers should provide for their citizens. Forget that. Rulers are ruling for a reason. They're the smartest ones in the room. They have the best judgment. If they say we should destroy this bridge, then they destroy the bridge, right? Like, it's not about what the citizen wants. It's about what the ruler wants. The rulers must do whatever to ensure obedience from their citizens. You must be willing to sacrifice your individual freedom for the state. So, legalism sounds a little bit like tyranny, right? Like, it's all about strict obedience to the government and to the law. It favors an authoritarian state ruled by force. You use the army to control your population. It believes that human nature is inherently evil and requires constant discipline, because if you're not constantly controlling them, people are just going to do evil stuff. And you might be thinking, no, we won't. Really? If no one's watching, like, would you steal the last donut? Like, really? If people are inherently good, then why do we have so much evil in the world? Right? So, human nature is evil, according to legalism, and requires constant discipline. It's people's responsibility, their duty in life, to just serve the government, whatever the government wants. It's not going to be very successful in China overall, because, it turns out authoritarian rulers, not super popular. People like freedom. But it has influenced other policies and ideologies. And all three philosophies are getting at the same thing. They're trying to figure out, how do we live in perfect community and society? Because here's the thing with China. China has always had a very large population. So you need an effective way to have everyone living together. So let's talk about Chinese society. We have multi-generational families. That means you are living in the same house as grandparents, aunts, uncles, cousins, children. Fathers, the male heads of households, have absolute authority over women and children. They would arrange marriage, sell the labor of family members. Only men can conduct rituals and make offerings to ancestors. A man can only have one wife, but multiple concubines. So concubines are like professional mistresses. So I have my one official wife, and then here are like my 10 concubines, the other 10 women who I sleep with and live with and feed and stuff. So men are encouraged to have concubines because it's so important to have a male heir to keep alive the cult of ancestors, right? So ancestor worship is a key part of Chinese religious beliefs at this time. The only person to properly worship and, keep the memory of the ancestors alive is a male, is the man. If you don't have a son, not only will your line die out, but the spirits of everyone who ever came before you will die out as well, because there will be no one left to offer sacrifices and provide for these spirits. So that means, let's say your spouse dies. If you're a man, you got to get remarried. You got to have that son. If you're a woman, no. Remain a widow, right? Don't dishonor your dead husband. All right. Last thing for China, the Warring States period. All right. I really want you to watch this one. Who was Confucius? It's a TED Ed. It's not very long, but it does give you a good sense of his philosophy and influence. And I can't overstate how influential Confucianism is on Chinese society and the relationships within it. All right. The Warring States period follows the Zhou period. It is this time of increased violence. Basically, everyone's fighting with each other. So, We see that the Zhou really declined because of the weaknesses of feudalism. It relies on loyalty and nomadic invasions. You're going to see most of our Chinese dynasties really collapse because of nomadic invasions. The Qin dynasty is going to emerge, and we'll talk about it later this unit, but as you can see, they're not around for very long. All right, so discussion question time. If you are watching this on Edpuzzle, you're going to be responding to it there. Either way, I would like you to pause and make sure you can answer these questions. What kind of political system did the Zhou use? Was it effective or ineffective ultimately? How did Chinese rulers use religion to justify and strengthen their power? Okay, so take a moment to answer that. Okay, so we are continuing on. All right, this is a great crash course video. It does cover like all 2,000 years of Chinese history, but if you want to watch the beginning of it to get a sense of what we've talked about, I always recommend it. This is really interesting as well, just considering what do we mean by when we talk about civilization in general. Okay, so we're returning to the Middle East. The Iron Age. The Iron Age is essentially a shift in technological breakthroughs. So before, we were in the Bronze Age, aka the height of technological innovation, bronze. Now it's iron, basically. So we refer to this time period, 2000 to 500 BCE, as the Iron Age. So we are going to talk about ancient Israel. You might be thinking about, like, why? Israel is super small, right? You can see here on this map. Wait. So here's Mesopotamia. Okay. Once again, a beautiful circle. So here's Babylon. We have Egypt happening over here. The Hittites are up here. We haven't really talked about them. They're just another ancient society. So what we're going to be talking about today is going to be the Palestine region here for ancient Israel. The Phoenicians, super interesting. We have zero time to talk about them. Similarly, the Minoans are over here somewhere too. No time to talk about them anymore in the new curriculum, but very interesting. All right, moving on. So in your notes somewhere, or if you're on Edpuzzle, in a discussion thing, I want you to think about 5 to 10 things you already know about Judaism. If you were one of my students last year, or if you took AP Human Geography in any class, you learned about this last year in your unit on culture. So what do you already know? Take a moment to respond. All right, let's talk about Israel. In the beginning, Israel is not a political state. It begins as just a people group. So when we refer to Israel, we refer to the land between the eastern shore of the Mediterranean and the Jordan River, occupied by the Israelites from the early 2nd millennium BCE, so about 2000 BCE. So it was settled first by Mesopotamia. And the reason why they're significant, that we are learning about them, is that they are the first civilization to really believe in and sustain monotheistic religion. So we've had other small societies like be monotheistic for a little bit. Think about like the Amarna period in ancient Egypt. But usually that's a blip on the radar, and then you go back to polytheism. This is going to be a consistent thing. The reason why we're learning about Israel is because of its religion primarily and the long-lasting impact it's going to have, especially with Christianity. So, the Israelite people were nomadic herders and caravan drivers who developed a complex, sedentary agricultural society. As they did so, their cult of a desert god evolved into an influential monotheistic religion. Geography is important here as well. So Israel is located, I'm going to go back to a few slides, at an important crossroads for trade. So here is Palestine. Sorry. So that means if Egypt wants to do trade with Mesopotamia, they have to go through here, right? If anyone in sub-Saharan Africa wants to do trade with the Hittites, they're probably going to go through here, right? They have to go to their ports. If Mesopotamia wants to do trade with Africa, they have to go through here, right? So if the Hittites want to invade Egypt, if the Egyptians want to invade Syria, like they are in this middle spot. That's going to mean that they are going to experience a lot of invasions, but economically, they're in a pretty significant location. Okay, so Israel history has a lot of archaeological roots, but you also have the narrative aspect of Israel's history from the Hebrew Bible. So Israel itself has few natural resources. The religion that's going to be so important is going to be codified into the Torah. And the Ten Commandments, the laws, the Levitical laws, reveal the influence of Mesopotamian law and culture, right? Think about like an eye for an eye, an ear for an ear, a tooth for a tooth. That's Hammurabi. So originally, they're nomadic herders. The political state of Israel comes later. So in the beginning, there's a guy named Abram, and he's born in the Mesopotamian city of Ur, and he begins migrating, and God appears to him and is like, you're my chosen people. Go here, do that. I'll bless you and your descendants forever. I choose you. So they settle. There's conflict. There's strife. Eventually, some of the population, most of the population, right, migrate to Egypt because there's a famine in the land in Israel. Originally, they're not slaves, but over time, they do become slaves. The migration and enslavement is linked to the Hyksos. Remember the Hyksos, those Turkish invaders, right? That's happening all along the same time. We have no Egyptian records of slaves, but the migrants and the records align with the major building project of the New Kingdom. All right, they're in Egypt, they're slaves. Moses sets them free. Let my people go. If you haven't watched Prince of Egypt, it's a fun movie. Interestingly enough, so Moses is like, let my people go. Pharaoh's like, no. Moses is like, I'm going to do plagues. And Pharaoh's like, do your worst. The plagues themselves are meant to align with the various Egyptian gods, right? So remember how important the Nile River was to the Egyptians, right? Moses turns it to blood. How like night falls as one of the later plagues, right? So it means the god Ra doesn't rise up. How eventually Pharaoh's son dies when the angel of death comes, right? So that means that, the next Pharaoh, right, Horus reborn, is dead. I can't remember all of them off the top of my head, but we do have in the historical record evidence of some of these plagues happening, and you can align them with the gods. It's pretty neat. Obviously, if you're not religious, there's other rationales for why these things are happening. But in general, it's kind of neat. Okay, so they decide, all right, leaving Egypt, going back to Israel. They get halfway to the Sinai Peninsula, Moses is like, hold that thought. I'm going to go talk to God. I'll be back. While he's gone, they decide to make a golden calf out of gold. God's mad. They're stuck in the desert for 40 years, just like walking in circles. Eventually, 40 years are up. They're allowed to settle in Egypt. They destroy the Canaanite cities that were already there. The historical record confirms this, right? We have lots of archaeological evidence of these conflicts. And you have multiple tribes, multiple conflicts, charismatic leaders, the judges emerge to deal with the problems. That's not working, so we get a monarchy. So our first king is going to be Saul, second king David, and then third one Solomon. These are the significant kings for all of Israel. The capital is in Jerusalem. We see that they do a lot of trade with Africa, and so the state of Israel gets pretty wealthy and powerful. They build the temple, right, this place of worship to their God, using resources that they get from Tyre, which is a Phoenician city, from Africa, from the Middle East. We see that there's a large gap between rich and poor, especially over time. The priests become this really powerful and wealthy class of people. So Israel's society. Again, multi-generational families all living together. The eldest male is in charge, very patriarchal. Male heirs are important. So if you don't have a son, you should adopt one or have sex with a slave and get one that way. Women are respected and have influence over their husbands, right? It is expected that a wise husband would listen to his wife. However, they can't own property or initiate divorce. In an urban society, some women would work outside the home. In a rural society, it doesn't really matter. Everyone's working on the farm. But we see that few women are actually holding positions of power in ancient Israel. We see that kinship ties are really important. So you have extended families and you practiced arranged marriages. Monogamy was the norm. Men were allowed to have extramarital relations. Women were not. In early Israel, women enjoyed relative equality with their husbands in social life, but at the same time experienced certain legal disadvantages, like a woman could not inherit property or initiate divorce. The main occupations of women was bearing and raising children, maintaining the household, engaging in agriculture and herding. But as society became more urbanized, women began to work outside the home. Okay, so Israel splits in 920 BCE into Israel, which makes up the northern part, and Judah, which makes up the southern part. And they unite briefly to fight the Neo-Assyrians, but they lose. So Assyria conquers Israel, the northern state of Israel, not Judah, Israel, and moves its people, right? So this was a practice we see in this time period of sort of forced migration after you conquer people. So Judah is going to survive until the Babylonians conquer them, destroy the temple, and move lots of people. So this is one of the reasons why we have the Jewish diaspora, right? Is because of these forced migrations. We see some significant religious developments during the period of fragmentation. The concept of monotheistic was sharpened. The results are that you have these diasporic communities, these communities of people, right, Jews, Israelites, living outside their homeland, a diaspora. So these people are living all throughout the Mediterranean and the Middle East. The result is some people will eventually make their way back to Israel, but a lot of people remain in the communities they are taken to. So the loss of political autonomy and exile sharpens Jewish identity. They practice monotheism. They have strict rules that they follow in regards to what they eat. Keeping kosher, no pork, no shellfish, no meat, no dairy together, ritual baths, honoring the Sabbath, no working, no fighting on that day, no marrying non-Jewish people, right? This leaves them isolated but creates a powerful sense of community. It's also going to make them set apart from whatever community they're currently living in. So one of the things we also see throughout history is that the Jewish community becomes a scapegoat or a target in times of crisis. In part, it's because they keep to themselves and they haven't fully assimilated into what everyone else is doing. All right, so how would you feel if you were one of those captives? What would the results be? What do you think? I know it says Crash Course on Christianity. Just watch the first part, which is about Judaism. All right, last discussion question. How did the civilization of Israel develop, following both cultural patterns typical to other societies and its own religious tradition? All right, your summary. Compare how Israel's religious views matched up with other civilizations' religions, and explain how and why the religions and belief systems affected the development of Israel, Mesopotamia, and China. Thanks for listening, guys. If you have any questions, please let me know. Don't forget to complete your daily cover page and to turn it in.